You are standing in a forest in late autumn, and you know something the animals around you don't fully know, or at least don't know the way you know it. You know that in 6 weeks, this forest will be dead. The berries will be gone. The roots will be frozen into the ground like stone. The animals themselves will thin out, go quiet, disappear into burrows and hollows you can't reach. You know winter is coming. Not as a feeling, as a fact. And you know that the version of you standing here today, well-fed, warm enough, reasonably safe, is going to have to answer for the version of you that exists 8 weeks from now, starving in the snow, unless you do something about it right now. That single thought, the future is coming, and I am responsible for it, is one of the most dangerous ideas a species ever had, because acting on it requires something most animals never developed. It requires you to work today for a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet, to deny hunger now to prevent starvation later, to trust a plan you can't see the end of. This is the story of when ancient humans first learned to do that. When did we first store food for later? And the honest answer is stranger, older, and more revealing than most people expect. Here's the question nobody thinks to ask about ancient humans, because we're too busy asking about the dramatic stuff. The spear points, the cave paintings, the migrations out of Africa. Storage doesn't get coverage because storage isn't glamorous. Nobody made a documentary about a pit full of nuts. But food storage might be the single most consequential behavioral shift in the deep human past. More consequential than fire, arguably more consequential than language. Because it's the moment a species stopped living entirely in the present tense. Every animal on Earth deals with hunger. Almost none of them deal with the future. A lion doesn't kill 2 gazelles because it's planning for Tuesday. A wolf doesn't ration its kill across the week. Most predators live inside an unbroken now, eat when there's food, suffer when there isn't, and have no cognitive machinery for bridging the gap between the two. Ancient humans built that bridge, and once it existed, everything downstream of it, property, planning, economy, civilization, became possible in a way it simply wasn't before. So let's actually answer the question. Not the sanitized textbook version, the real one, with the evidence, the false starts, and the parts that still confuse researchers today. Start with what doesn't count as storage, because the line is blurrier than people assume. Squirrels bury acorns. Some birds cache seeds in tree bark, sometimes thousands of them, and remember the locations with a precision that puts human memory to shame. Chimpanzees have been observed carrying food away from a kill site to eat later, away from competitors. None of this is unique to humans. Catching behavior, in its simplest form, is old. It shows up across mammals and birds independently, which tells you it's a useful trick that evolution has stumbled onto more than once. But there's a difference between an animal following an instinct wired into it by millions of years of selection and a species consciously, deliberately building a system. A squirrel doesn't decide to cache. It's compelled to. It has no concept of December when it buries an acorn in September. It's running a program, not making a plan. Human food storage is different in kind. Not just degree, because it requires modeling. A future that doesn't exist yet, and choosing to act on that model against the pull of immediate hunger. The earliest hints of something like this in the human lineage are frustratingly hard to pin down, because storage often leaves almost no trace. A pit full of nuts from 40,000 years ago doesn't look like much in the archaeological record. The nuts rot. The pit fills in. Unless conditions are unusually good, waterlogged, frozen, or buried in ash, the evidence simply doesn't survive for us to find. This means every date archaeologists give for the origin of food storage is almost certainly a minimum. The real behavior is older than what we can prove. That caveat matters, so keep it in your back pocket for the rest of this. With that caveat in place, here's where the physical evidence currently points. Some of the clearest, most unambiguous storage evidence comes from the Upper Paleolithic, the tens of thousands of years leading up to the end of the last ice age. Sites across Central and Eastern Europe, from what is now the Czech Republic through Ukraine and into Russia, have produced storage pits dug directly into permafrost or cold subsoil. Some associated with the mammoth bone dwellings that ancient humans built during the coldest stretches of the Ice Age. These pits weren't accidental holes. They were engineered cold storage, dug below the frost line specifically because the people digging them understood that cold slows decay. That's not a small insight. That's applied food science, arrived at without a single lab, a single thermometer, or a single word of written theory. Go back further, and the evidence gets thinner but doesn't disappear. There's growing archaeological support for deliberate plant food processing and probable storage going back over 100,000 years, tied to sites where roots, tubers, and starchy plant material were being gathered, processed, and likely cached for lean periods, long before anatomically modern humans had spread across the globe. Some researchers argue that even earlier hominins, not just our own species, may have practiced basic caching behavior, though the evidence there is thinner and more contested. What's not contested is this. By the time modern humans were established across Africa, Europe, and Asia, food storage in some form was already part of the behavioral toolkit. Not a late invention bolted on right before agriculture. And that's the twist that surprises most people. There is a persistent myth that storage is an agricultural invention, that hunter-gatherers lived hand-to-mouth by necessity, eating what they found the day they found it, and that only farmers, with their granaries and grain surpluses, figured out how to save food for later. That myth is wrong, and it's wrong in an interesting way. Hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists across the last 2 centuries, from Arctic populations to desert foragers to temperate forest dwellers, almost universally practice some form of storage. Dried meat, smoked fish, cached nuts, rendered fat sealed in containers, preserved berries mixed with fat into a dense, shelf-stable paste. Agriculture didn't invent storage. Agriculture scaled it up and made it permanent, tied to a fixed location instead of a mobile one. The instinct and eventually the skill came first. The wheat field came later. This forces a reframe of how we think about the so-called agricultural revolution. It wasn't the moment humans learned to plan for the future. That moment happened tens of thousands of years earlier, in a pit dug into frozen ground by people who had never seen a domesticated plant in their lives. Agriculture was the moment that planning got industrialized. The cognitive leap, the actual hard part, storing food for later, happened long before anyone planted a seed on purpose. So what was actually required, cognitively, to make that leap? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because storing food for later isn't one skill. It's a stack of skills, and each one had to develop before the next could function. First, you need what researchers call mental time travel. The ability to project yourself into a future state you're not currently experiencing and treat that imagined state as real enough to act on. This sounds obvious to you sitting here, because your brain does it constantly and effortlessly. It is not obvious in evolutionary terms. Most animal cognition is built around immediate stimulus and immediate response. Building a neural system capable of simulating a future that hasn't happened, and caring about the outcome of that simulation as much as you care about your current hunger, is a genuinely rare capacity in the animal kingdom. And it almost certainly didn't appear all at once. Second, you need delayed gratification, the willingness to leave food uneaten today specifically so it exists tomorrow. This is psychologically harder than it sounds, especially in a body running a calorie deficit, which ancient humans frequently were. Every stored calorie is a calorie you didn't eat when you were hungry enough to eat it. That's a real cost, paid in the present, for a benefit that only pays off if your prediction about the future turns out to be correct, and if nothing goes wrong between now and then. No theft, no spoilage, no forced move to a new camp. Ancient humans were making a bet every time they buried a cache, instead of eating everything on the spot. Third, and this is the one that gets skipped over most often, you need trust. Individual storage only works if you're confident the cache will still be there when you come back for it, which means it needs to be hidden well enough, or protected socially well enough, that other people or animals won't take it first. And group storage, which is far more common and far more effective than individual hoarding, requires something even harder, a shared agreement that the stored food belongs to the group, or to specific individuals, and that raiding it outside of agreed terms is not acceptable. That's not a cognitive skill anymore. That's a social contract. The moment humans started reliably storing food together, they were also, whether they realized it or not, inventing an early concept of property and a set of enforceable norms around it. Long before formal law, before writing, Before anything you'd recognize as an institution, there was a buried cache of dried meat and an unspoken understanding about who was allowed to dig it up. Now layer the actual physical science on top of the cognitive story. Because ancient humans weren't just deciding to store food, they were solving real preservation chemistry with no theoretical framework at all, purely through observation and trial and error across generations. Drying works by removing water, and without water, the bacteria and fungi that cause spoilage can't function. Ancient humans figured this out empirically. Meat cut into thin strips and exposed to sun, wind, or fire smoke dries fast enough to become shelf-stable for months. This technique appears independently across essentially every hunter-gatherer culture that has been studied, from Arctic populations drying fish on wooden racks to African foragers drying game meat in the sun, which tells you it wasn't transmitted from one central source. It was discovered, lost, and rediscovered constantly, because the underlying physics rewards anyone who tries it. Cold storage works on a related principle, slowing the metabolic activity of the microorganisms responsible for decay. The permafrost storage pits mentioned earlier are a direct, sophisticated application of this principle, essentially a Paleolithic refrigerator, dug by people who had no concept of a microorganism, but understood, through repeated observation, that meat buried in frozen ground stayed edible far longer than meat left in the open. That's the scientific method running in the wild, centuries before anyone named it that. Smoking adds a third layer, because smoke isn't just drying meat faster. It's depositing compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties onto the surface of the food, extending its usable life well beyond what simple air drying achieves. Whether ancient humans understood the chemistry is irrelevant. They understood the outcome. Smoked meat lasts longer than unsmoked meat, and that was enough to make smoking a standard technique across smoke-adjacent cultures worldwide. And then there's fermentation, arguably the most cognitively demanding preservation method of all, because it requires trusting a process that looks, by every immediate sense, like spoilage. Fermented food changes color, changes smell, sometimes changes texture in ways that would trigger every instinctive disgust response a human being has. And yet across multiple, independent ancient cultures, people learned to let certain foods sit, ferment, and transform, because the end result was not only safe, but more nutritious and longer-lasting than the raw version. That is an extraordinary act of accumulated trust in inherited knowledge. Somebody, at some point, ate the first batch of something that looked wrong and smelled wrong, and either survived to tell people it was safe, or someone else watched closely enough to learn from a failure without repeating it. Either way, that knowledge got passed down, refined, and turned into deliberate technique. Compare all of this to how other species handle the same basic problem, and the difference becomes stark. A squirrel scatter-hoards, burying single nuts across dozens or hundreds of locations, relying on sheer volume and decent spatial memory to recover enough of them later, and accepting that many caches will simply be lost, forgotten, or stolen by other animals watching the burial happen. It's a strategy built on redundancy, not precision. Some birds are more precise, capable of remembering thousands of individual cache locations with an accuracy that still isn't fully understood by neuroscientists. But in both cases, the behavior is individual, instinct-driven, and largely uncoordinated. There is no squirrel village holding a meeting about how to divide the winter nut supply fairly. Human storage went a fundamentally different direction. It became social almost immediately. Instead of many individuals each hiding small amounts of food from each other, groups pooled resources into shared caches, built collectively, guarded collectively, and drawn from according to social rules that governed who got what and when. This is a completely different strategy from scatter-hoarding. It trades the redundancy of many small hidden caches for the efficiency and security of a few large defended ones, and it only works if the social trust described earlier actually holds. When it holds, it's extraordinarily powerful, capable of carrying an entire group through a lean season that would kill an individual forager relying on personal caches alone. When it breaks down, when trust fails, when someone raids the group store for themselves, the consequences ripple through the whole group at once. Food storage didn't just require social structure. It selected for it, rewarding groups that could maintain cooperation and punishing groups that couldn't. This is where the philosophical weight of the whole subject really lands. The moment ancient humans began reliably storing food, they crossed a line that most of the animal kingdom never crosses. They stopped being purely reactive creatures, responding only to the world as it currently existed, and became creatures who could act on a world that didn't exist yet. A predicted world, built out of memory, pattern recognition, and imagination. Every stored cache was a small act of faith in a future the person burying it would never get to see confirmed until it arrived. Every dried strip of meat, every buried nut, every fermenting container sealed against the winter, was a physical bet placed against uncertainty by a mind capable of imagining its own hunger months in advance and taking that imagined hunger seriously enough to act on it today. That capacity, sitting quietly underneath the more famous milestones of human prehistory, the tools, the fire, the art on cave walls, might be the real foundation all of it was built on. You cannot plan a hunting strategy across seasons without believing the seasons will keep happening. You cannot build a shelter meant to last through a winter you haven't experienced yet without believing in that winter's arrival. You cannot form a society with rules about property and sharing without first believing that tomorrow is real enough to argue about. Food storage forced that belief into existence, tested it constantly against the brutal feedback of starvation when the belief was wrong or the plan failed, and slowly refined it into one of the defining features of what makes human cognition different from almost everything else. Alive. Every refrigerator hum in every kitchen on Earth right now is the direct descendant of a permafrost pit dug by hands that never held a written word. Every pantry, every root cellar, every vacuum-sealed bag of dried meat in a hiking pack is running on the same basic logic somebody worked out in the cold, hungry, dark tens of thousands of years ago. The future is coming. I will not be there to meet it if I do nothing now. So I will act today on behalf of a self that does not yet exist. That is not a small idea. That may be the idea that made everything else possible.